The city always spoke of Mr. Williams, the millionaire, with awe. His face often appeared in newspapers, smiling at charity events or shaking hands at business meetings. People admired his success and his sharp mind. They called him a man who could turn anything into gold. His mansion on the hill was a symbol of power, its tall gates guarding marble floors, glittering chandeliers, and a world most people could only dream of. Inside that mansion, every detail was polished to perfection. The walls were covered with expensive paintings. The halls echoed with quiet footsteps of servants, and the air smelled faintly of fresh flowers delivered daily. There was never a moment of disorder. Every corner was spotless, every room shining. For the millionaire, this was normal. He lived in comfort, shielded from the struggles ordinary people faced. But while the mansion sparkled, its master rarely noticed the small details of life inside it. He was too busy. His days were spent in offices, boardrooms, or traveling to meet investors. When he returned home, it was usually late at night. A driver opened his door, a servant carried his bag, and the cook prepared his dinner. Everything was done for him, and he never had to lift a hand. Among the staff was Grace, a black maid who had worked in the mansion for years. She moved quietly, cleaning rooms, preparing tea, and making sure everything was in order. To Mr. Williams, she was almost invisible. He greeted her sometimes with a nod or a quick thank you. But his mind was always somewhere else, thinking about numbers, deals, and his ever-growing empire. The only person who slowed him down was his old mother. She lived in the same mansion, though her health had weakened over time. Her hair had turned white, her steps were slow, and her voice was soft. She loved her son deeply, but she often felt he was too far away, even when he sat in the same room. She would wait at the dining table, hoping he might spend an evening with her. But more often than not, he was gone before she could speak more. Then a few words, it was Grace who spent the most time with the old woman. She sat beside her, read books aloud when her eyes grew tired, and walked slowly with her in the garden. Sometimes Grace would laugh at the old woman's stories, and sometimes she would simply listen. Their bond grew strong in a way no one else in the house noticed. Grace was not just a maid to hers, she was a companion, almost like a daughter she never had. Mr. Williams did not see this. To him, his mother was safe, cared for, and surrounded by staff. That was enough. His focus was always on the next deal, the next contract, the next million to earn. He believed that giving his mother a comfortable life in a mansion was proof of his love. One late evening, as he entered the house after a long day, he walked past his mother's room without stopping. The door was slightly open, and he could hear Grace's gentle voice reading a story aloud. His mother's soft laughter followed like a fragile bell. Mr. Williams paused for a moment, surprised by the sound, then shook his head and continued toward his study. He had work to finish, papers to sign, and phone calls to make. He told himself there would be time later to sit with her. There was always tomorrow. The millionaire's life was comfortable, but it was also empty in ways he did not yet understand. He had power, respect, and wealth, but he did not see the quiet sacrifices happening under his own roof. Grace never complained, never asked for recognition, but she carried a silent strength inside her. She knew the mansion was not only a place of wealth, but also a place of loneliness. And she had taken it upon herself to fill that loneliness for the old woman, even if no one else noticed. For Mr. Williams, the days blended together in the same pattern: meetings, wealth, late nights, and a quick glance at his mother before disappearing into his world of business. He thought life would always be this way, steady, safe, and under his control. He had no idea that everything could change in a single moment, that the maid he barely noticed would soon do something that would open his eyes forever. He lived in his comfort, unaware that soon he would be forced to see beyond the polished walls of his mansion. He would learn that true wealth is not measured in gold or houses, but in loyalty, love, and the courage of those who are often unseen. The days in the mansion passed with quiet rhythm. But for Mrs. Williams, the millionaire's elderly mother, each day felt heavier than the last. Time had slowed her body and made her fragile. Her once quick steps had turned into careful shuffles, and her strong voice now carried the soft tremble of age. She lived in comfort, surrounded by wealth. Yet her heart often longed for something simple: company, warmth, and someone to share her thoughts with. Most mornings, she sat by the tall windows in her room, wrapped in a shawl, watching the garden. Outside, the roses bloomed in perfect lines. The grass trimmed like velvet, but beauty meant little when seen alone. Her son, though living under the same roof, was rarely at her side. He rose early for business calls, rushed out to meetings, and returned late with his mind still full of numbers and deals. She loved him dearly and never complained. She knew he was busy, and she told herself he worked hard to provide for her. Yet deep inside, she sometimes wished he would sit down beside her, even just for a cup of tea, and ask her how she was feeling. It was a wish she never spoke aloud. It was Grace, the maid, who noticed these silent wishes. Grace had been working in the mansion for years, moving quietly, completing her duties with steady hands. She was used to being unnoticed by the master of the house, but she had always been noticed by the old woman. From the first day, Mrs. Williams had spoken to her with kindness, asking her name, asking about her family, and treating her as more than just staff. Slowly, their connection grew. Grace was not only the one who swept the rooms or prepared meals. She became the person the old woman leaned on. She would pour tea and sit beside her, listening patiently as the old woman shared stories from her youth, how she had met her husband, how she had raised her son, and how the world had changed so quickly. Grace listened with genuine interest, her eyes warm, her laughter soft when the old woman teased her with old jokes. In return, Grace sometimes shared her own stories. She spoke of her village far away, of her mother who had taught her how to be strong, and of the hardships she had faced before coming to the mansion. She did not complain, but her words carried the weight of struggle. Mrs. Williams admired her strength and compassion. Their conversations filled the room with life, making the mansion feel less lonely. The other servants noticed the bond, but said nothing. To them, Grace was simply doing her duty. But the truth was deeper. She cared for the old woman not because of salary, but because she saw her as human, as someone deserving of love and attention. At night, when the mansion grew silent, Grace often stayed longer in Mrs. Williams's room, reading aloud from a book. The old woman would close her eyes, listening to Grace's gentle voice until sleep took her. Grace would then tuck the blanket around her and quietly leave. These small acts of care became part of their daily rhythm, something both looked forward to. But not everything was easy. Mrs. Williams's health was delicate. Some days her hands shook so much she could barely hold a cup. Other days she grew tired after just a short walk in the garden. Doctors came and went, prescribing medicine and advising rest. The millionaire paid for the best care, but medicine could not cure loneliness. Grace understood this better than anyone. There were moments when the old woman's sadness slipped through her calm smile. Once, as Grace brushed her hair, she whispered, "I wonder if my son knows how much I miss him." Grace's heart ached at the words, but she did not answer. Instead, she squeezed the old woman's hand gently, giving comfort without speaking. Meanwhile, Mr. Williams remained blind to these quiet struggles. To him, his mother was safe, surrounded by staff, living in luxury. He believed that comfort was enough, that money had solved every problem. He did not see that the true problem was not lack of comfort, but lack of connection. One evening, Mrs. Williams fell while walking to her chair. Grace rushed to her side, lifting her carefully and calling for help. The old woman insisted she was fine, but Grace saw the fear in her eyes. After that day, she never left her alone for long. She watched over her like a daughter would, with love that went far beyond duty. The millionaire heard about the fall, but he only asked the doctor to visit more often. He did not stay home longer, nor did he sit by his mother's side. To him, providing medical care was the answer. To Grace, the answer was presence, being there, listening, offering warmth as the weeks went by. The bond between Grace and Mrs. Williams grew so strong that even the other staff quietly respected it. They often said among themselves that Grace cared for the old woman as though she were her own blood. And in truth, Mrs. Williams began to feel as if Grace truly was family. Sometimes she would hold Grace's hand and say softly, "You are a blessing in this house." Grace would smile and bow her head, her heart full. Though she knew the master of the house would never notice such words, what neither of them knew was that soon this bond would be tested. An event was approaching that would reveal the depth of Grace's loyalty in a way no one could have imagined. The old mother's fragile days were not only marked by weakness and quiet longing. They were leading toward a moment that would shake the entire mansion, and especially the millionaire himself. For now, the mansion remained calm, filled with routine. The son chased wealth, the mother longed for connection, and the maid quietly filled the empty spaces with her care. But fate had already prepared a test that would change their lives forever. The mansion stood silent under the golden light of afternoon. The air was calm, almost too calm, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Mrs. Williams sat in her usual chair by the window, gazing at the garden. Grace was near her, carefully folding fresh laundry, humming a soft tune that filled the room with a gentle rhythm. It seemed like just another ordinary day. The world outside was peaceful, the sound of birds faintly drifting through the glass windows. Yet hidden beneath that quiet afternoon was something no one expected, a danger that would soon break the stillness. Grace left the room for only a moment to fetch tea from the kitchen. She moved quickly, not wanting to leave the old woman alone for long, but in those short minutes, the unexpected happened. The front door of the mansion creaked open, not with the polite knock of a visitor, but with the hurried push of someone who did not belong there. A man stepped inside. His footsteps were heavy, his movements rough. He was not a servant, nor a guest. He was an intruder. His eyes darted quickly, searching, hungry. He had heard rumors of the mansion's wealth, of the treasures inside, and he thought it would be an easy targetan old woman, a house full of valuables, and a son who was rarely home. Mrs. Williams looked up, startled, as the stranger entered her room without hesitation. She tried to rise from her chair, but her frail body would not let her move fast enough. Her hands trembled, clutching the armrest, while her heart pounded with fear. "Where is the money?" the man demanded, his voice sharp and cruel. His presence was like a shadow stretching across the room, swallowing the peace that had been there only moments ago. Mrs. Williams stammered, I don't know what you mean." Her voice shook, fragile as a whisper. At that very moment, Grace returned with the tray of tea. She froze in the doorway, her eyes widening at the sight of the stranger standing over Mrs. Williams. For a second, her heart stopped. But then, instinct took over. She placed the tray down carefully, almost silently, and stepped forward. "What are you doing here?" she asked firmly, her voice calm but strong. The intruder turned toward her, sneering. "Stay out of this. Want the valuables? Bring them to me, or the old woman suffers." Grace's blood ran cold. She had no weapon, no strength compared to him. But she had something stronger, her loyalty, her courage, her will to protect the woman she had come to love like her own mother. "No," she said, standing between the intruder and Mrs. Williams. "You will not touch her." The man laughed harshly, stepping closer, towering over her. "And what will you do?" "You're just a maid." Grace's heart raced, but she did not move aside. She spread her arms wide, shielding Mrs. Williams with her body. Her eyes burned with determination. "I may be a maid," she said, her voice steady, "but I will not let you harm her." The old woman gasped softly behind her, tears welling in her eyes. She had never seen such courage. Grace's simple act of standing her ground felt like a wall of protection stronger than all the riches in the house. The intruder, irritated by her defiance, grabbed Grace's arm roughly. Pain shot through her, but she did not flinch. She twisted free and shouted loudly, hoping the sound would reach the other staff or even scare the man. "Leave now. The police will come," she cried. The intruder hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the door, unsure if her warning was true. That hesitation gave Grace the strength to push him back slightly, enough to create distance. Her body shook with fear, but her spirit refused to break. Mrs. Williams clutched the edge of her chair, whispering, "Grace, please be careful." Her voice was weak, but full of love and worry. The standoff stretched for long seconds that felt like hours. Grace stood firm, breathing hard, every muscle tense, while the intruder's anger grew sharper. He muttered curses, debating whether to press forward or flee just then. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. The butler and one of the guards had heard the commotion. The intruder panicked, realizing his time was short. With one last glare at Grace, he rushed out of the room and disappeared through the back entrance. Grace exhaled shakily, her body trembling from the rush of adrenaline. She turned immediately to Mrs. Williams, kneeling beside her. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her hands gently holding the old woman's fragile fingers. Mrs. Williams shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "No, my dear, but you stood like a lion." Her voice broke, overcome with emotion. "You saved me." Grace lowered her eyes, trying to catch her breath. "I only did what was right," she whispered. Yet, in her heart, she knew she had risked everything, her safety, even her life, for the woman who had treated her with kindness. The butler and guard arrived moments later. But by then, the danger had already passed. They were shocked to hear what had happened, and even more shocked to learn how Grace had faced the intruder without fear. They looked at her with new respect, whispering among themselves that she was no ordinary maid. Later that evening, when the mansion returned to its uneasy calm, Mrs. Williams could not stop holding Grace's hand. She spoke softly, her voice still trembling. "You were my guardian today. You were my angel." Grace smiled faintly, though her heart was still heavy with the memory of the man's cruel eyes. She knew the danger had not only threatened the old woman, it had shaken the mansion's very sense of safety. And soon, someone else would hear about this event, the millionaire himself. He would return, unaware of what had unfolded in his absence. And when he learned of it, when he discovered how his maid had defended his mother, his world would never be the same again. The mansion had returned to silence after the intruder fled, but the quiet was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, uneasy. Like the air before a storm, Grace sat beside Mrs. Williams, still holding her hand. Her body ached from the rough grip of the stranger, and her mind kept replaying the danger. Yet her face remained calm. She didn't want the old woman to see her fear. "Don't worry," Grace whispered gently, brushing a loose strand of gray hair from Mrs. Williams's face. "You are safe now." Mrs. Williams gave a weak smile, though her eyes were still wet with tears. "Safe. Because of you," she murmured. Grace wanted to reply, but the sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted her. Strong, quick, and heavy, they didn't belong to the butler or the guards. Her heart froze when she realized who it must be. The door opened, and there stood Mr. Williams, the millionaire himself. He had returned earlier than expected, his suit still sharp, his briefcase in hand. But as his eyes fell on the scene before him, he froze. He saw his mother trembling in her chair, her hand tightly clutched by Grace. He saw the tray of tea spilled on the floor, a chair slightly overturned, and Grace standing protectively between his mother and the door, her body tense as if still shielding her. What happened here? His voice was sharp, filled with alarm. He dropped his briefcase onto the table without care and rushed forward. Mrs. Williams tried to speak, but her emotions caught in her throat. Grace stepped forward instead, her voice steady despite the shaking in her heart. "There was an intruder, sir. He came into her room. He threatened her." The millionaire's face darkened instantly, his jaw tightening. An intruder? In this house? His eyes flashed with anger. He turned toward the butler, who stood nervously in the doorway. "How could this happen?" The butler stammered. We came as soon as we heard the noise, sir." But by then, he had already fled. Grace interrupted softly, but firmly. "He would have harmed her, sir, if I had not stood in his way." The millionaire turned his gaze to her. For the first time, he truly looked at her not as a servant, not as just a maid moving quietly in the background, but as a person standing, tall with courage. Her eyes held no fear now, only determination, though her hands still trembled slightly. "You?" he asked, almost in disbelief. "You protected my mother?" Grace did not flinch. She nodded slowly. "I could not let anyone touch her. She is too precious." Those words struck him deeper than he expected. Precious, he himself rarely thought of his mother in that way, any more not because he didn't love her, but because his life had become a storm of meetings, deals, and wealth. Yet here was his maid, calling his mother precious, standing in front of danger for her without hesitation. Mrs. Williams finally found her voice. She gripped her son's arm, her frail fingers trembling. "It's true," she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. She stood like a lion. "She saved me when I could do nothing. My son, you should have seen her. She was braver than anyone." The millionaire was stunned into silence. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from something unfamiliar: shame, gratitude, and awe, all tangled together. He stared at Grace, trying to understand. Why would she risk herself? She was just a maid, a worker in his house. He paid her wages, yes, but nothing more. Yet she had faced danger for his mother in a way he himself never had. He had always believed that money could protect his mother. Expensive doctors, top-level security, the grand mansion, all of it was supposed to keep her safe. But when danger truly came, it was not money that stood against it. It was this quiet maid, this woman he barely noticed most days. Grace lowered her eyes, uncomfortable under his intense stare. "I only did what anyone with a heart would do," she said softly. "She is kind to me. She treats me with respect. I could not stand aside." Her words were simple, but they cut through him like truth often does. He thought back to his own behavior. How many times had he brushed off his mother's needs? How many evenings had he chosen meetings over spending even a few minutes with her? And yet this maid, someone unrelated by blood, had given her more care and protection than he had. The room was silent for a long moment. The butler and guards stood quietly, watching, sensing that something deeper was happening. Mrs. Williams held on to her son's hand tightly, waiting for his response. Finally, the millionaire spoke, his voice lower now, softer. "Grace, I owe you more than I can ever say. You defended her when I was not here. You showed courage. Courage I did not expect." Grace shook her head gently. "You owe me nothing, sir. Only did what was right." But inside him, The words stirred, something he could not ignore. He realized that he had been blind not only to grace, but to the very meaning of loyalty, love, and protection. That night, long after the house had settled again, he sat alone in his study, unable to concentrate on work. His mind kept replaying. The scene: Grace standing tall, her arms spread wide, shielding his mother. Her voice ringing out firmly, "You will not touch her." The image burned in his memory. For the first time in years, he admitted to himself that all his wealth meant little compared to what he had witnessed. Money could buy many things, but it could not buy the kind of loyalty and courage that Grace had shown. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The event had shaken him, but it would also lead him to face questions he had long avoided about himself, about his mother, and about the people he had overlooked in his pursuit of wealth. Grace's brave stand was not just an act of defense. It was a mirror held up to his life, showing him everything he had forgotten. What he didn't know yet was that this moment would change the entire course of his life. The maid he had barely noticed would become the reason he saw the world differently. And the shocking truth of her courage would echo far beyond this one afternoon. That night. The mansion seemed heavier than usual. The chandeliers glowed softly, the marble floors shone, and every corner looked polished. But the wealth surrounding the house did nothing to calm the storm in Mr. Williams's heart. He had witnessed something that unsettled him deeply, something that refused to leave his thoughts. His maid, Grace, standing like a shield between his frail mother and danger. He had seen courage before in business meetings, in men who fought for deals, in investors who took risks. But this was different. This was not for profit, not for gain. This was raw human bravery. Grace had no reason to risk herself, yet she had done it. And in that moment, he had realized something he could not ignore. She had given his mother the kind of protection and attention that he, her own son, had failed to give. Unable to sleep, he paced his study. Papers lay untouched on his desk. Contracts unread, deals waiting. For the first time in years, none of it mattered. His mind was full of his mother's trembling hand, her tearful eyes, and Grace's firm voice declaring that she would not let harm come. At last, he left his study and walked slowly toward his mother's room. The hallway was quiet, the night deep. When he entered, he found her awake, sitting up in bed with a blanket around her shoulders. Grace sat on a stool beside her, reading softly from a book. They both looked up when he stepped in. His mother smiled faintly, though her eyes still carried the weight of the afternoon. Grace quickly set the book aside and rose to her feet. "Good evening, sir," she said respectfully. Mr. Williams nodded, but his eyes stayed on his mother. "How are you feeling?" Mrs. Williams patted his hand as he came closer. "I am fine, my son. A little shaken, but fine." Thanks to her. She tilted her head toward Grace, her voice full of pride. "You should have seen her. She was strong, stronger than I have ever seen anyone in this house." Grace lowered her gaze, uncomfortable with praise. "I only did what I had to, ma'am." But Mrs. Williams shook her head. "No, Grace. You did more than your duty. You put yourself in danger for me. That is something beyond wages, beyond responsibility. That is love. That is loyalty." Her words pierced the millionaire's heart. He sat down slowly, his usual confident posture replaced by something softer, more uncertain. "Mother," he said quietly, I should have been here. Us should have been the one to protect you." His mother squeezed his hand gently. "You are busy, my son. I understand. You think your business is for me, for this house, for comfort. But let me tell you this." Her eyes shone with emotion. "Comfort is not the same as care. Wealth is not the same as presence. Tonight, I was not saved by riches. I was saved by someone who cared." The word struck him harder than any business loss ever had. Comfort is not the same as care. Wealth is not the same as presence. They echoed in his mind like a truth he had buried under years of chasing success. He looked at Grace. Really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. She was simple in appearance, her uniform plain, her hands calloused from work. Yet there was a strength in her, a dignity he had never noticed. And now, that strength had saved the most important person in his life. "Grace," he said softly, his voice unsteady. "Why? Why would you risk yourself like that? You could have been hurt, even killed." Grace lifted her eyes to meet his. Her expression was calm, almost serene. "Because she is kind," she replied simply. "She treats me like a person. She listens to me. She talks to me. She values me. In my life, sir, not many people have done that. She has given me respect. And I would give my life to protect her." The room fell silent. The millionaire's throat tightened, his chest heavy. Here was a woman with no wealth, no power, no status, yet she possessed something he lacked: true loyalty, born from love. Not obligation. His mother smiled softly through her tears. "Do you see now, my son? It is not money that makes people stand by you. It is the heart. Grace has shown me more love than all your millions could ever buy." For the first time in years, the millionaire felt his eyes burn with tears. He turned, his face slightly ashamed of the emotion rising in him, but he could not hide it. The truth was too powerful. Grace stepped back quietly, sensing the moment was between mother and son. She picked up the book and slipped out of the room, leaving them together as the door closed softly behind her. Mrs. Williams reached out and cupped her son's face with her trembling hand. "You are a good man, my son," she whispered, "but you have been lost in your world of wealth. Today, you must open your eyes. Money built this house, but love keeps it alive. Don't forget that again." The millionaire bowed his head, overcome with guilt and gratitude. He kissed his mother's hand gently, something he had not done since he was a child. "I promise, mother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will not forget. Not again." Later that night, alone in his room, he thought of Grace's words, of his mother's fragile grip, and of the intruder's shadow still lingering in his mind. He realized that his life was at a crossroads. He could continue as he had wealthy, but blind, or he could change, truly change, and see the people around him for who they were. That realization would shape everything that came next. And though he did not know it yet, Grace's brave stand had not only saved his mother, had saved him too. From a life empty of meaning, the next morning. The mansion looked the same as always: polished floors, glittering chandeliers, staff moving quietly in their duties. Yet for Mr. Williams, nothing felt the same. He walked through the halls with a heaviness in his chest, as if the events of the previous day had shaken the very ground he stood on. He had always been proud of his achievements, the businesses he built, the fortune he created, the reputation he held. All of it had made him believe he was a strong and successful man. But now, when he thought of strength, the image that came to his mind was not himself at a meeting table, but Grace, the maid, standing tall and unshaken in front of a threat. That image refused to leave him. It haunted him as he sat at the breakfast table, untouched coffee growing cold in front of him. It followed him as he signed papers, his pen scratching across the lines while his mind drifted elsewhere. And it grew heavier when he looked at his mother, who now smiled warmly at Grace as though she were her own daughter. At first, he told himself it was gratitude, that he simply felt thankful for Grace's courage. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was realization. For years, he had lived believing money solved everything. He had built walls of wealth around his mother, thinking that security guards, luxury rooms, and endless comforts were enough to protect her. Yet when danger had walked right into the house, all that wealth had been useless. It had been Grace, not the money, not the guards who had truly protected her. That truth burned in him like fire. After breakfast, he went to his study and sat at his desk, but the papers in front of him blurred. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, and memories rushed to him, memories he had long buried. He remembered his childhood, when his mother had shielded him from bullies at school, standing in front of him with the same fierceness Grace had shown yesterday. He remembered the nights she had stayed awake to care for him when he was sick, sacrificing her own rest just so he could feel safe. She had given him her whole life, never once asking for anything in return. And what had he given her back? Wealth? Yes. A mansion? Yes. But had he ever given her what she truly needed? His time, his presence, his heart? The answer hit him like a blow. No, he hadn't. His throat tightened. For the first time in years, he saw himself clearly, not as a proud millionaire, but as a son who had forgotten the most important part of being a son. Later that day, he found himself standing at the doorway of his mother's room. Grace was there again, gently combing Mrs. Williams's hair while humming softly. The sight touched him deeply. His mother's face was relaxed, her eyes shining with trust. He cleared his throat softly, and they both looked up. Grace started to rise, but he gestured for her to stay. "No, please, continue," he said, his voice gentler than usual. He sat by his mother's side and watched as Grace worked, her hands steady, her expression calm. For the first time, he noticed the small details, the care in her touch, the patience in her movements, the way she leaned closer when the old woman spoke so she wouldn't miss a word. "Grace," he said suddenly, breaking the silence, "I owe you more than I can ever repay." Grace looked surprised. "Sir, you don't owe me anything. I only did what anyone would do in that moment." "No," he said firmly, his eyes holding hers. "Not anyone would have done what you did. You risked yourself for her. That is not something money can buy." Mrs. Williams smiled faintly, her hand squeezing his. "You see now, don't you, my son?" she whispered. He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "Yes, Mother, I see now." The shocking realization came in waves, each stronger than the last. He realized that Grace, a maid with nothing, had shown more strength, love, and loyalty than many of the wealthy men he dealt with daily. He realized that his mother's happiness came not from diamonds or velvet chairs, but from the simple kindness of someone who truly cared. And most painfully, he realized that he had been absent, blind to his mother's needs, while chasing things that no longer seemed important. That evening, he walked through the garden alone, the cool breeze brushing against his face. The mansion loomed behind him, grand and imposing, yet strangely empty. He looked at the roses his mother loved, their petals glowing softly in the fading light. He whispered to himself, "All of this means nothing if I cannot even be the son she deserves." His hands clenched at his sides, his chest heavy. For years, he had defined himself by his fortune. But now, for the first time, he wondered if all that wealth had blinded him. Grace's courage had opened his eyes, showing him what true wealth looked like, not money, but love, loyalty, and human connection. The realization was painful, but it was also powerful. It was the kind of truth that changes a man forever. When he returned inside, he found Grace in the hallway, carrying a tray of medicine for his mother. She paused when she saw him, lowering her eyes respectfully. "Grace," he said softly, "from this day forward, you are not just a maid in this house. You are part of this family." Grace's eyes widened in shock. "Sir, he raised a hand. "No arguments. You have already proven your place. My mother trusts you, and now." "So do I." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. She bowed her head humbly. "Thank you, sir." As she walked past him into his mother's room, he stood still, his heart heavy but also lighter than it had ever been. He had finally understood something that years of wealth had never taught him. The shocking realization was clear. Money could build walls, but it could not build love. Power could control people, but it could not earn loyalty. True wealth came from the heart, and Grace had shown him that in the most unforgettable way. And deep inside, he knew this was only the beginning. His life, his priorities, his very soul, everything would change because of this truth. That night. Silence wrapped around the mansion. The staff had gone to their quarters, the lights were dimmed, and only the faint ticking of a clock echoed through the wide halls. Yet in one of the grandest rooms of the house, Mr. Williams sat awake, restless and unable to escape the storm of thoughts crashing inside his mind. He sat in a leather chair by the window, staring out at the moonlight spilling across the garden. A glass of untouched wine rested on the table beside him, but he had no desire to drink. His chest felt heavy and his throat tight, as if all the emotions he had suppressed for years were fighting to break free. All his life, he had been taught never to show weakness. His father had raised him to be strong, to never cry, to never let emotions cloud his judgment. And so he had built walls around his heart, walls made of steel, discipline, and pride. Those walls had kept him cold, but powerful, feared, but respected. Yet now, those same walls were crumbling, brick by brick. Because of one simple truth, he had failed the people who mattered most. The memory of Grace, standing in front of his mother, returned again, vivid and sharp. Her small frame, her fearless eyes, her trembling hands that did not back down. She had shown more bravery in that moment than he had in his entire life. And his mother, fragile and old, had trusted Grace more than him. That trust was not given lightly. It meant something. It revealed something he had refused to see for far too long. His mother's happiness did not come from luxury cars, golden chandeliers, or fine dining. It came from feeling safe, cared for, and loved. And he, her own son, had failed to give her that. The thought pierced through him like a blade. He lowered his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking as silent tears fell. He tried to stop them. He wanted to fight them back, the way he always did, but this time it was impossible. The emotions poured out, raw and uncontrollable. For the first time in decades, the powerful millionaire cried not out of anger, not out of frustration, but out of guilt, sorrow, and overwhelming regret. He thought of his childhood again, of his mother holding his hand when he was small, guiding him across the street, protecting him from every danger. She had never let him down. Never. And yet, here he was, realizing how much he had let her down by chasing wealth instead of giving her his time. He thought of all the missed dinners, the birthdays he had skipped, the lonely afternoons his mother had spent while he sat in meetings with strangers. He thought of the words he had never said, the thank yous, the I love yous, the apologies. Now those words weighed heavy on his chest, desperate to escape. The sobs grew louder. His chest heaved as if he were gasping for air after years of holding his breath. The man who had been seen as unshakable, untouchable, was now reduced to a son grieving for lost moments he could never reclaim. Suddenly, there was a soft knock on the door. He quickly tried to wipe his face to hide the evidence of his tears. But the door creaked open before he could compose himself. It was Grace. She held a small tray with a cup of tea, her expression calm, but her eyes full of quiet understanding. She stepped into the room, her footsteps light. "Sir," she said gently, "I thought you might need this." He looked at her, his eyes red and swollen, his pride shattered. For a moment, he considered pretending, putting on the mask of strength again. But something inside him broke completely. His voice trembled. "Grace, I don't deserve this. I don't deserve any of it." She placed the tray on the table and stood silently, waiting. "I failed her," he whispered, his voice cracking. "My mother. I failed her as a son. I gave her riches, but not love. Comfort, but not care. And yesterday, when it mattered most, it was you who stood up for her, not me." Tears streamed down his face again, uncontrollable. He buried his face in his hands, his sobs filling the quiet room. Grace hesitated, then slowly walked closer. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sir," she said softly, "you are not a bad son. You are human. Sometimes people get lost chasing things they think are important. But the fact that you see it now, that you feel this pain, this means you still have time to change." Her words were simple, yet they cut through him like light in darkness. He lifted his head, his face wet with tears, and looked at her with eyes full of pain and hope. "Do you really think it's not too late?" he asked brokenly. Grace nodded. "It's never too late to show love. As long as your mother is here, you have a chance to give her what she deserves." The weight in his chest shifted. The tears still flowed, but now they were mixed with something else, a fragile spark of relief. He wasn't doomed. He wasn't finished. He still had time to make things right. He reached out, gripping Grace's hand tightly. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Not just for saving her yesterday, but for saving me today." Grace smiled faintly, her eyes shining with compassion. That night, as he finally lay down to rest, he felt lighter, though still fragile. His heart ached, but it also beat with new purpose. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking of business deals or profits. He was thinking of his mother, her smile, her laughter, her warmth, and he silently promised himself that from tomorrow, everything would change. He would no longer be just the proud millionaire. He would be a son again.